Montana Constitution's Declaration of Rights, including the environmental right, which cause great legal mischief and may in fact be backfiring and creating a long-term detriment to Montana's environment and to our enjoyment of it. And I can illustrate these flaws best by comparing the Montana Constitution with the U.S. Constitution. I love constitutional rights, but there is a significant difference between the type of rights delineated in the U.S. Constitution and Montana's Constitution. Please listen carefully to what I wrote in the 2010 VIP arguments for CC2, which was the new call for the CONCON. Quote, historically, the U.S. Constitution delineated rights which barred government intrusion on basic freedoms, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, etc. Individuals can freely exercise these freedom rights without imposing costs on anybody else. Montana's Constitution unfortunately misadventured into guaranteeing so-called rights which aren't just freedoms, but are more properly called entitlements, and can only be provided to someone at great cost to Montana's taxpayers and economy. End quote. I need to move this a little closer and higher, or my neck will be stiff. So in standard legal parlance, freedom rights are called negative rights, and entitlement rights, or privilege rights, are called positive rights. Now this seems counterintuitive in my view, because in my view, negative rights are the good ones, and positive rights are the bad ones. Why? Freedom rights are negative because they are in effect prohibitions on government intrusion into your personal space and freedom. Entitlement rights, on the other hand, are called positive rights because they require proactive government action to effectuate. If government says everyone has a right to make a living or a right to a well-paying job, somebody has to pay for that entitlement. Usually the taxpayers or your co-workers or your employer, somebody has to pay for entitlement rights. And I'll digress for a minute here. We panelists had a great conference call last week, and I informed my co-panelists that I would actually be comparing the Montana Constitution's environmental right with the U.S. Constitution. And CB jumped in and said he'd be anxious to hear my discussion of the U.S. Constitution, since to his knowledge, the U.S. Constitution says nothing about environmental rights. And he is precisely correct. The framers of the U.S. Constitution carefully included only negative rights, or freedom rights, in the Constitution and Bill of Rights. The framers carefully attempted to avoid the inclusion of any positive rights or entitlement rights, precisely because they had great fear of limitless government power. Their little tiff with the King of England that Brian again alluded to last night, their little tiff with the King of England gave them great pause about providing any constitutional empowerments which permitted government to proactively venture into any sphere of entitlement, whether it be the right to a job, the right to health care, or the right to environmental purity. Now granted, Montana's is not the first state constitution which has veered from the historical pattern of the U.S. Constitution. Other state constitutions, depending on the political leanings of their framers, began inserting certain entitlement rights. So the courts then responded by developing a rule of historical jurisprudence. And I need to get myself a glass of water. I apologize, I'm on medication that makes my mouth very dry. And some of the other legislators are glad of that. So the courts responded by developing a rule of historical jurisprudence. Negative rights, barring government intrusion on freedom, were self-executing and could be enforced directly by the courts, while positive entitlement rights were not self-executing and could not be directly implemented by courts, but must be fleshed out statutorily by legislation. This is somewhat related to the political question doctrine that some of you may be familiar with. historical jurisprudence stated that positive rights could not be directly decided by courts, were not justiciable, without statutory guidance, because they involved political questions, qualitative decisions. For example, what constitutes a proper standard of living? What is a quality education or adequate health care? These are qualitative decisions. Courts historically said these questions should be left to legislative bodies to decide, rather than vested in a single judge or a single court. And the Montana Constitution, after the '72 convention, was sold to Montana voters precisely under the premise that the environmental right was a non-self-executing right which courts could not use arbitrarily without it being well defined first by the legislature. But after the passage of the '72 Constitution, the Montana court took a substantial left-hand turn, becoming the most activist Supreme Court in the entire country. Our court abandoned some of the restraints of historical jurisprudence, including the rule about non-self-executing positive rights. And there were two different nationwide studies, one done by Jeff Rance and another, that documented the fact that the Montana court had become the most activist court in the entire nation, overturning its own precedent at an alarming rate. So then, specifically with respect to environmental rights, Montana courts ignored the fact that voters had only, first of all, narrowly approved the Constitution at a primary election, by the way. It had been very narrowly approved with 50.4% of the vote. But moreover, they ignored the fact that it was narrowly approved under the publicly stated premise that the environmental right was a non-self-executing provision that had little significance aside from future legislative action to define its parameters. As I stated again in the 2010 voter information pamphlet, quote, "The clean and healthful environment provision has since been expanded by Montana's overzealous courts to prohibit any public or private activity which implicates the environment, unless you can prove a compelling state interest permitting it." Not a compelling personal interest, but a compelling state interest permitting it. Thus, the Montana Constitution's environmental right now empowers judges and bureaucratic rule makers to micromeddle in your property rights, business affairs, and personal conduct. Traditionally, the prevailing balance between conflicting entitlement rights, such as the right to earn a living, which is also in the Montana Constitution, but the prevailing balance between such conflicting rights, such as the right to earn a living and the right to a clean and healthful environment, that conflict was decided by legislatures through political discourse and statutory law, rather than decided by judicial decree based on vague constitutional phrases and even vaguer interpretations thereof, end quote. So by declaring that the environmental right is a self-executing right, our courts have created a legal quagmire. Lawsuits can be and are brought ad infinitum against any resource or any energy development because everything we do implicates the environment. When I go bow hunting, it implicates the environment. And so everything becomes judicially decided. So how does this legal quagmire affect Montana's environment? The problem with positive rights is that somebody has to pay for them. More specifically, the problem with the right to a clean and healthful environment is that it is both a positive right and it is an infinitely open-ended phrase which can never fully be satisfied. Even if you diverted Montana's entire economic gross product to try to pay for it, it is open-ended. And some argue that that's exactly what has happened in the 4 decades since the 1972 Constitution was adopted. Prior to the '72 Constitution, average wages in Montana ranked in the top 10 in the nation. 40 years hence, we now consistently bounce along at dead last wages in the entire nation. Now, as I said, I've spent my entire life in Montana's mountains and great outdoors. But here's the problem with delineating these flowery phrases, positive right phrases, in Montana's Constitution. Because of the high cost of implementing this open-ended entitlement right, you run the risk of killing the goose that laid the golden egg. And this is a key point I want to make. Paying for a clean environment is only possible if you have a robust economy. This is why the U.S. economy is far less polluting and far more advanced in environmental safeguards than less prosperous industrial economies in Russia and China, for instance. It was mentioned about the air quality in Missoula. I went to school at the University of Montana in the 70s. I agree. The air quality is incredibly better today. But it's not better because of some judicial decree. It's better because of advances in technology. And it requires a robust economy to pay for those advances. So, Montana, I believe, is dangerously close to killing our own ability to pay for environmental safeguards. And I'm just about done, man. In fact, I would submit that if Montana were an independent nation, if we were not propped up by federal transfer payments, Montana's economy and wages would have already slipped into third world status. And our environment would already be reflecting that third world, third-rate care. So in summary, we all want a clean environment. But I would argue that the question is whether it should be provided for constitutionally through inserting vague positive rights or provided for statutorily. I believe the CONCON erred in placing a positive environmental entitlement right in the Constitution. Montana courts have strayed from historical jurisprudence, and I believe they have erred in making the environmental right a self-executing right, which, absent legislative parameters, can be used to shut down enterprise ad nauseum, destroying what was once a very robust economy, and in the long term, even destroying the economic prosperity necessary to afford a clean and healthful environment. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And I'm looking around for Jeff. I appreciate those comments focusing. Jeff, there you are.
Thank you, Dean Irma. And yes, thank you very much, all of you, for participating this morning. As I look around the room, I see an attack coming, an assault. I very much appreciate, most of the folks that are in the room here today are either staff of the Humanities of Montana. There are 8 delegates, former delegates from the Montana Constitutional Convention, but I am confident that everyone in this room is here